Hey, everybody, welcome to the first Uptime FM episode of 2023. I'm your host, Sean C. Davis, and today I am joined by Evan Sheehan to talk about web components. Now, I'm not sure how deep we'll get in this short time that we have today, but I'm really excited about this topic because I've noticed this resurgence of web components, which is an idea that's been around for more than 10 years. And there's been a little bit more chatter on it that at least that I've noticed in the last year or so. And some people have some interesting predictions on where it might go, what we might see throughout 2023. And so that's what I really want to explore today with Evan. And so with that, let's bring Evan in. Welcome to the show, Evan.
Hey, Sean, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for joining us. And I know I've got a ton of questions for you, all really surrounding web components. But first, we have to start with that classic Uptime FM question, which is, what is the best sandwich?
Well, let's see. There's two answers for me, because there's the answer from before I was vegan, which would have been cheesesteak from Pat's in Philly.
Okay.
But obviously a cheesesteak with Cheese Whiz is off the table now that I'm vegan. So
yeah.
I think probably I'd actually go with kimbap.
Okay.
Which is, we might get some flack for whether or not that constitutes a sandwich, because there's no bread. It's a Korean thing where you take rice and a sheet of seaweed, and then some like sauteed mushrooms and carrots and things like that, and it gets folded up into this little handheld sandwich, I think. And those are great.
So the substitute for the bread, is it the seaweed or is it the? It is the seaweed. Okay.
Yeah. So it's a little bit like a giant sushi roll, except it's not a roll. It's flat and square, like a sandwich.
Ah, interesting. Okay. Well, folks who are listening in on the show know that I have a very loose and liberal definition for sandwich, very inclusive of all sandwiches. So I feel like that's a great and unique answer. Now, do you have to go to a specific restaurant to get this type of sandwich, or is this something you'll make at home as well?
You can they're pretty easy to make at home. Folding them takes a little bit of practice, but if you have a short grain sticky rice, and you can get big sheets of nori from the store, and I'm sure if you did a web search for kimbap, you'd find plenty of recipes. I'm not sure where my wife found this one, but it's something we do for lunch all the time.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so you're basically just buying the same ingredients that you would buy for a sushi roll.
Yeah, pretty much. And then it's just a little bit of practice to fold the seaweed.
Okay. Very cool. I like it. All right. Well, with that, let's shift over to web components. So now they've had a really interesting history over the last decade, and I only have just a kind of a small amount of experience, and most of that is concentrated about 5 years ago, when I felt like they weren't really super popular at that time. But for context, I did some digging earlier today and saw that the idea was first, well, maybe the idea is older, but that they were first presented in 2011. And then Polymer, one of the bigger libraries early on, or frameworks early on, came around in 2013, which is right around the time that React also has its initial release. And I'm sure we'll dive into all of that. But I wanted to set that context first, just overall in the space, but thought, Evan, you could start with where did you come in, and like what initially got you interested in web components? What drew you to them?
Yeah. So I think my experience tracks a lot with a lot of the people that I talk to about these things. So I probably came across Polymer in like 2015.
Okay.
And was kind of interested in it, but I didn't really understand that it was building on platform stuff. I thought it was just like another JavaScript framework. It wasn't until a year or two later that I understood that that web components were like a native web thing. Like this wasn't React or Vue or something like that. And I got really excited because I liked the idea of, I've always kind of liked the idea of fewer dependencies in the software that I build. So I got sold on React in 2015 by someone I was working with. And so I've been working with it for a couple of years. And the appeal of just getting away from Webpack and React and all of this, and just being able to go back to writing HTML and JavaScript and CSS was really was really kind of nice. And I think like a lot of people, I was disappointed because I thought, like when you said component to me at that time, I was thinking React component or Vue component or Angular
Yes, yeah.
component, right? And web components they're not really a drop-in replacement for those most of the time. And so it was frustrating. And Shadow DOM was like, wait, you mean if I have a component that builds a form, none of the inputs in my form are going to pick up the styles on my page? That really sucks.
Right.
So I didn't really like, I wanted them to be great and they just weren't doing the things that I needed. And so I didn't really touch them again until last year. I think was it maybe a little bit before last year. And what got me back into them was two things. Like you said, there was kind of an uptick. People were starting to talk about it again. Dave Rupert did his course on web components for, I think it was Front End Masters. So he was talking about it a lot. Like if you listen to Shop Talk Show or something like that, you heard him talking about it a lot. And I was really looking for something for a project at work that really minimized dependencies. One of the organizational problems we face at work is that a project will get funded for 9, 12, 15 months. And then at the end of that project, there's no more funding. You're not really supposed to be working on it, but people are still using it. And this happened to me last year, you'll get an email from the Department of Homeland Security telling you that there is a security vulnerability because you're running some wicked old version of jQuery on this application that nobody has touched in 6 years. And you sit down and you try to spin up the development environment to deal with this problem, and you can't even get the dev environment running because it's built using Grunt and Ruby SAS. And you don't have Ruby installed on your computer anymore because it's 2022 and we're all using Dart SAS now. So I was really trying to avoid having that happen again because I did not want another one of those fire drills. And so I started looking really hard at web components and found that, at least for this particular project, there are several use cases that they fit really well for me. And so that's kind of when I started to get really excited and really back into them.
Okay. Super. So I want to spend some time with that, but first to back up a little bit. So you said that you were using React around 2015, but that's right around the time that you also discovered Polymer as well. So were you using these concurrently, or did you find one first and then replace it with the other?
Polymer, I was just reading about. We hadn't actually tried it.
Gotcha. Okay.
It was just because 2015, at least in my recollection, and certainly for me personally, 2015 was the year that React really took off. Like that was the year I started using it. Up until that point, it felt like there were 600 different JavaScript frameworks that were all, everybody was, I mean, there was Angular. Angular had been around for a little while. Probably nobody remembers Flight.js, which was Twitter's JavaScript framework. I built a project in that, which had some nice qualities. I was also very early on Vue. I think might even have been pre 1.0, and that was a mistake because we hit some performance issues. That was not Vue's fault. It was my fault for jumping on the bandwagon too early in production. But so that it was at that point that someone I worked with was like, well, React is pretty solid. Maybe we should switch to that. And so we did. And that's what kind of took off. But yeah, Polymer was one of those things where I was just like casting around for tools for building web applications, and it was one of the ones that came on my radar because it was from Google, and the web components thing was interesting.
Yeah, and I had a similar sort of journey, maybe shifted slightly, but in those, right around that year, 2015, 2016, spent a lot of time with Angular, which really wasn't a super pleasant experience because that was when they transitioned from Angular JS to Angular 2. We were right in the middle of that. And it was all just kind of a messy time for components, but it led to what we have today. And so, you said you've been using web components for about a year now, in more in the traditional sense, or are you using them completely, using the native APIs just completely by themselves, or are you using any tooling around them?
So for the web components, we're not using, like, it's not built with lit or anything like that.
Right.
They're
Okay.
really just web component. I mean, I'm using libraries in them because one of the use cases that I have found that they work really nicely for, at least for me, is data visualization, which I do a lot of at
Mm.
work. And so I used D3 for handling the rendering of the component of the visualization, either on a canvas or in an SVG. So I am using libraries in them, but otherwise I'm not using any particular tooling for that. What I found that works really nicely is using them in conjunction with a JavaScript framework like Vue or Svelte that plays really well with web components. I don't know if
Mm.
React still has problems with web components. I believe they used to have a lot of problems with them. But yeah, like so I am using some tooling for Svelte, and I'm using Svelte to kind of organize and coordinate the business logic in the application for the
Yeah,
component.
so it's all your routing and everything like that is through Svelte.
Yeah, and state management and that kind of thing.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, if that's actually really interesting. So if you have an application using that yeah, you're using Svelte for everything else, what's the argument or the use case for when you would break out and adopt a web component?
So the first thing is I do as many things as are appropriate in a web component. I will choose to do as a web component first. So
Okay.
like the things people run into sticking problems like we mentioned before with Shadow DOM and how things in the Shadow DOM won't pick up your global styles. And so one epiphany I had very early on that led me to this hybrid approach was if you want it to pick up your app's styles globally, don't put it in Shadow DOM. It doesn't belong there. That's the
Mm,
whole
mhm.
point of Shadow DOM is to keep styles from leaking in and out. So if you want the styles to leak in, it's something that probably shouldn't go in Shadow DOM, at least until there's a solution for that. And I know that there are open proposals for, I forget what it's called, um, open stylable or something like that, that would allow styles to leak into the Shadow DOM but not out, which would allow buttons to pick up your button styles and things like that.
And right
Um,
now, there's no option to, like, if you're going to build a web component, it is going to get rendered into the Shadow DOM. You can't opt in or out of that,
you
correct?
no, you can totally
You
opt
can.
out of Shadow DOM. If
Ah,
you
okay, okay.
if you read the lit documentation, they tell you not to do that, and I think that's a little heavy-handed. I think if you
Mhm.
wanted to build a um, a web component that writes to the light DOM, there's no reason not to. Like
Okay.
it's not at that point, it's not doing anything really significantly different than your JavaScript framework like Svelte or React is doing, right? Like they get a handle on some element in the DOM and then they write a bunch of stuff inside of it. And then that stuff is all there and something else can, like jQuery, can come along and grab those elements and mess with them. And
Okay,
so using
okay.
a web component that way, I don't see what the problem is. Shadow DOM gives you added protection because if there are implementation details that people shouldn't be messing with, which I find is often true for if I'm building a visualization in SVG, there's a ton of elements in there for the
Yep.
axes and the titles and things like this, and people just don't need to know about them. So stuffing them in Shadow DOM is nice because it keeps them out of the
Okay.
way. And then I only have to expose parts that need to be configured, like the tick labels, so that you can set the font size and things on your tick labels. But um, so I'll put as much as I can into a web component, but they end up being one of two kinds of components. Then um, I end up either with basically a leaf node. So um, this is not a thing that is doing any kind of orchestration between components. It is a thing that is orchestrated, like a line chart or a
Right.
map or
Okay.
something like that.
Mhm.
If you compare that to a form, you might have a form that provides a bunch of inputs where you're selecting what data is being displayed. Like
Right. Yeah.
some of those form fields might be synchronized, and whenever they get updated, you need to fetch different data. Like that's an orchestration task. I wouldn't use a web component for that, probably.
Yes. Okay.
So if it's some kind of a leaf node in my application, it'll often end up being a web component. The other thing that they work really nicely for is some kind of a container. So the example that I came up with for this project that I'm working on is I want my visualizations to resize with, the browser window, right? Like I use a lot of the responsive layouts from Every Layout that Andy Bell and Hayden Pickering wrote. And so it responds really nicely to the size of the browser. And I want the SVGs in there to scale with them. You can't attach Mutation Observer to an SVG. So
okay.
if you want to use Mutation Observer to detect a change in the size of the SVG and update the view box, you have to put the SVG in a div. And I had messed around with like class hierarchies and things to make this work. And the solution I ended up with was just a chart container web component that has a div and a default slot. And so whatever you put inside of it ends up in the default slot. And as long as the thing inside of it has a width and height property, then it will work. There's a mutation observer that gets hooked up to the div. And whenever the size changes, sorry, not mutation. I keep saying mutation. It's a resize observer. Doesn't work with SVG. So whenever the resize observer fires,
Okay.
It will set the width and height on whatever is in the default slot.
Because then you have to target all the children in there, right? And and resize them. Okay.
But so it doesn't do any real rendering, and all it does is set up this situation where I have a div that will fill whatever is containing it, and then I have a resize observer watching that div. And then whenever the resize event happens, I just take all of the contents of that default slot and tell them what their width and height is. And that's all the component does.
Interesting. Okay.
And it works great. It's so nice to just be able to slap that around whatever I need, and it'll get those resizes. And it's the same kind of thing that Island does. Zach Leatherman's Island partial hydration web component. Again, it's another container. It doesn't have any UI. But you can stick stuff inside of it and you can give it some attributes and it will load your JavaScript and hydrate your web component for you.
That's basically all. It's just, it is a component, right? But it's just watching on behalf of your component on, whether or not to hydrate.
Yeah, so that's when I use them. Those are basically the two use cases: is visualizations right now and containers that have JavaScript behavior associated with them.
Okay, that makes sense. And actually, the last point about hydration is something I've been interested in as well, because if we go back to that 2015, 16, 17, that we have React is like SPAs are really big in those days, and so I felt like we had the Jekylls of the world where, yes, we're going to put everything, we're going to render everything, pre-render everything. It's going to be static. We'll just use jQuery or whatever to add our limited interactivity. SPAs are getting more popular, but that's when then we start to see the emergence of Next and Gatsby and this kind of this approach where we can take these JavaScript based frameworks, component frameworks, and then we can still pre-render them. So we kind of get the best of both worlds. And I felt like when we were making that transition, there was still a big criticism for traditional web components in that, well, you need to use JavaScript. It didn't seem like anyone had solved the pre-rendering issue. And so and that could be wrong. That could have just been my perception, but I'm curious, is that accurate? Is that still the case today, or do we have some solutions out there for being able to build web components, but also pre-render them? Or is that's not what they're for, so we shouldn't worry about it?
Well, I mean, so are you talking about like being able to progressively enhance your web component so that you don't get just a blank page if JavaScript falls over? Or
Yeah, I think I'm touching on maybe there's two different ideas baked in here. One is that yes, absolutely. So when you land on the page, there's something there, and then I can hydrate that after the page has loaded. But the maybe the secondary question that I'm asking here is there any value in using web components when I don't need any interactivity for that component?
um, so the second question, is there any value in web components if there's no interactivity, is a big maybe.
Okay.
Um, I should have gone back and reread. Nolan Lawson has done some really great investigation into performance with Shadow DOM, and I haven't. It's been months since I read this particular article. I seem to remember that um, in very extreme cases, there can be some performance benefits from having styles encapsulated in the Shadow DOM, because you just have like lots of little small DOMs and you don't have one gigantic DOM that the browser needs
Mhm.
to resolve all of the CSS against. I think I might be misremembering this. And so maybe there's a good reason to do stuff like that. Um, but I mean, for me, most of the time, I probably wouldn't use a web component if there wasn't some element of interactivity.
That's fair.
Um,
And I guess that's you're also pairing it with another component framework that
yeah,
has that ability to do
I mean,
to do that.
the project I'm working on at work basically is just not going to work if JavaScript falls over, and it's for a very limited audience of people. So I
Okay.
feel fairly confident telling people like you have to be on an evergreen browser and you have to have JavaScript enabled. And I'll do my best to keep the JavaScript payloads down because I don't know what their connection is going to be like. But um, you know, uh, I mean, I've used so I did a couple months ago. I think I did a stream with Ben Myers, who does semantics, uh, Twitch stream, and we built some things with WebC that um, we had some web components that used Shadow DOM and didn't have any interactivity. We built a card component, and
Okay.
the only real advantage to that, and this it's kind of trite because I designed it specifically to be this way, but I designed the card so that it had a border around the end of the card, but there was a little tag at the top of the card, and the border kind of went through the middle of it.
Hmm.
Like if you the default styling on a field set with a legend in a form, um, it was basically that styling. And so
Okay.
what Shadow DOM let me do was hide the div that was used to create that border, and it allowed me to create an extra grid so that I could use grid to place that vertical line going through the center of that text. So the text was spanning 2 rows, and then the border only came up to the middle row that it was spanning. And so I kind of hid those details in the Shadow DOM, but realistically, there's like 600 different ways that you could have built that same design without Shadow DOM, and it would have been fine.
Yeah, fair. Okay. Okay. Um, so you've mentioned CSS a number of times. Is the approach today generally to just write the raw CSS, or do you usually is SAS still relevant in the web component world? How does how do you do your styling today?
I mean, for web components, I just write CSS.
You just write the
Um,
plain CSS.
yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I still use SAS for a project, because
Hmm.
usually what I find is that I have design tokens and I want those tokens. I need to write out utility functions for, setting margins and padding font sizes. I want to write out CSS properties that contain those tokens so that I can use those in places. Um, and that's for me a big part of where the value of SAS comes in, is that I can just write a couple of for loops over my tokens and then generate whatever I need to generate without having to figure out how to configure some other tool.
Mm-hmm.
So for a project, I'll usually have Sass, but when it comes to the web components, I usually just put a style tag inside of the template and just write vanilla CSS, because vanilla CSS is pretty awesome in 2022.
Yeah, right. It's gotten really powerful. And also with the way you've described using components as leaf nodes, and that they're generally not orchestrating, they're simple, that your styles, I imagine, end up being fairly simple as a result.
Usually, yeah. I've like a 3/4 of a screen of CSS would be a lot in most of the web components that I've written.
Okay. Okay.
Most of them are much smaller than that.
Interesting. Okay, so I with just a few minutes left before we transition to this last segment here, I thought we should spend some time on the future. Where are web components going? And oddly enough, this morning, just catching up, reading a couple different articles, I came across two predictions. One said that what did they say? They said Remix is going to go all in on web components and ditch React in 2023. I was like, that's a bold prediction. That's,
Yeah.
we could unpack that for sure. And then I read another prediction that said, I wrote the quote down because I thought it was funny. 2023 being the year of web components is about as likely as 2023 being the year for the Linux desktop.
I knew you were going to say that.
So definitely lovers and haters, believers and doubters. Where do you fall? What do you think is happening this year with web components?
Well, I mean, full disclosure, I'm currently talking to you from a Linux desktop, so
Fantastic.
that might tip my hand a little
perfect.
bit. I don't. My predictions for it are not nearly that bold. I hope that we will see increased usage with people like Dave Rupert advocating for them. And last fall, Brad Frost wrote a really great article on web components and the role they can play in design systems.
Read that one. That was great.
And like everything he talks about in there is a really great articulation of everything I have been thinking for the last year. The only difference is that I'm not working with design systems. But
okay.
I mean, he has a whole section in there on like, it's not either Vue or web components, it's Vue and web components, and there's value there. So I think it's probably mostly going to stay the same. Maybe like I know that Eleventy is really fond of web components. The creator of Eleventy, Zach Leatherman, created the Island web component that we were talking about earlier, and he also created the WebC compiler, which is a way of writing web components as single file components, kind of like Vue single file components or Svelte single file components. Really nice authoring experience, I think. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's kind of the main thing that people see with it. So, if Astro starts really leaning into web components too, I have no idea if they are planning to or not. We could maybe see more adoption. But I also think that part of the reason why people really don't like web components quite often, at least the people I talk to, is because web components quite often solve problems most developers don't have.
Interesting.
Because most developers when you're writing an application, what you're doing is that kind of orchestration thing that I was talking about earlier. You have state and business logic, and you just need to map that into existing elements and map inputs from users through those existing elements back into your logic and your state. And I mean, you can do that, like using them as containers and things like that, web components as containers, but I'm not sure there's much value there, and you still don't get things like your two-way bindings and your nice templating, unless you're doing something with lit. But again, lit tells you not to do things in the light DOM, and so then you run into the styling issues of shadow DOM. And I think the reason shadow DOM styling is such an issue for people is because most of the time it's not what they want. The reason it exists is to solve a problem you don't have. So it's a struggle to force it into that. So I'm not sure we're going to see huge movements. It would be great to see the platform doing more things to lighten the load of something like Svelte or Vue so that they don't have to ship as much JavaScript. But I think those things need to be like, we need native DOM diffing in the browser. It's bonkers to me that the easiest way to update your UI is to just write a big string to inner HTML, and the browser's not smart enough to just update the bits that need updating. It just blows away the whole tree and re-renders it.
Right. Yes. Yes.
You know, we need stuff like that. We need a way of creating bindings between like JavaScript objects and form inputs and things like that. Because even if you're using web components, you still have to do all that yourself. And so those are value that the JavaScript frameworks have that web components still don't. And I don't think they're on the horizon. I mean, so there's open declarative shadow DOM is implemented by Google. I think it's proposed, but I don't think it's been accepted. That would be a way to handle the server-side rendering you were talking about before.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not in love with it the way that it works. You end up shipping quite a lot of copies of your shadow templates, which seems unfortunate because we don't have HTML imports. But
so it's like every instance you're bringing the whole.
Yeah, you create a copy of exactly the template you want in the shadow DOM. So if you have a page with like 50 cards that all have the same shadow DOM, you've got 50 copies of that template.
Yeah, which means that you bring the styles each time too, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so, but that helps with the server-side rendering. That's how Lit handles server-side rendering.
Okay.
And then, like I said, Nolan Lawson, I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier. I've talked about him several times. He just launched yesterday a proof of concept for a polyfill for open stylable web components. And that's where your global CSS will leak into the shadow DOM, but the shadow DOM styles don't leak out.
Interesting. Okay.
And so that solves the problem of I put a button in my shadow DOM and it doesn't look like the rest of my buttons. So that's a problem that we are solving hopefully in the next couple of years. But that might increase adoption of web components, but I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah. And so it's okay. You see, it could go a number of different ways. And one of the ways it almost sounded like you were suggesting that these various other site frameworks and component frameworks can also push the browser to make some of these native APIs a little simpler, which could be really, really beneficial for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Google driving the open chat, the declarative shadow DOM stuff is a big part of why it's there. And you can see the value. Like Lit has a plugin for 11t that I think that will, if you have Lit components, it'll basically server-side render them for you or statically render them ahead of time.
Okay.
You know, and that kind of stuff helps. That helps deal with people's issues around progressive enhancement of web components. I don't want an empty page because JavaScript fell over kinds of things, but
exactly. Yeah.
I don't know. I'd love to see them get used more though, because I really do think they're great, and I think there is a place for them in most people's toolkits. It's probably not going to replace everything.
Yeah, it's not going to replace it in it, and I feel like one of the biggest things I took away from this conversation is that they can be a complement to these other tools that are out there, and they can be really valuable in those particular use cases. So it sounds like we just need to keep pushing and see what other use cases we can come up with, and make it all stronger, improve the developer experience. So it'll be interesting to follow and see if that momentum sticks around so that those improvements happen.
Yeah, and I think for anyone that's curious and wanting to try them out, like you're probably going to bump into things that you feel like you're banging your head against the wall because you're used to doing things a certain way. The thing that got me over that was instead of grumbling about how you can't do something with web components, try to think about, well, okay, forget everything else I knew. How would I solve this problem with this tool? And sometimes what you'll find is that it's not a good tool to solve this problem, so you should use something else. But sometimes what you'll find is there's actually a good way to solve the problem. It's just not the way you're used to doing it.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Evan. It's been really interesting so far. And before we wrap it up, I've got a series of 9 quick questions that will hopefully produce somewhat short answers, and then we'll wrap it up. Ready?
Okay.
All right. Here we go. Number 1. What is your favorite open source product?
Oh, that's tough. My favorite one would, I mean, the one that I use, there's 2 that I use basically every single day. If we set aside the Linux kernel,
I thought you might say Linux.
I can't really say that it's my favorite is the problem.
Okay, fair. Okay.
I think I'd probably go with Vim. It's the text editor that I use and have used for like 20 years now. And it's old, and I think it's great that it's still going that strong. And I know that like Vim fans can be insufferable, and I try really hard not to be insufferable about it. But I think it's cool that it's been around for that long.
Absolutely.
Yes. And that it's still going this strong.
And I've even noticed that some developers I've talked to will take I think there's is there a Vim mode in VS Code where you basically can have all the same key bindings and all of that?
There's a VI plugin for VS Code that is pretty good. It's gotten pretty good, but it's not Vim. It's
still not Vim.
Yeah. When you start getting really deep into the kinds of things you can do with Vim is when you start figuring out the kinds of things that they haven't implemented in that plugin. But it's really good.
Okay.
I used it for a while, and I was impressed at how much of the interface they had built into that plugin.
Very cool. Very cool. Look into that. Okay, number 2. This one requires a little bit of background because I felt like we tend to have folks on the show who are working at either developer-focused startups or bigger tech companies, and your resume is quite different, and I think that's super interesting. So making this into a short question, what is the most interesting thing about working for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration?
The most interesting thing for me is working with the scientists. The work I'm doing now, like the project I've been talking about the whole show, is to visualize model output from several of the climate models or weather models that we produce. I don't work in the part of NOAA that does climate prediction. We do short-term weather prediction. And just like, even just learning about the basics of what goes into numerical weather prediction, like a thing that we take for granted. Talking about the weather is considered boring, like,
right. Yes.
But it's something we've only been able to do for like the last 50 years. Like, NOAA started in the 70s under a different name, I think. And it exists because at that point, we had enough computing power to actually do it. It's not an old thing, weather forecasting. And
so you need all of that data.
Yeah, and we have my understanding was that NOAA has more data to work with than any company that you can think of, like Facebook and Netflix, and they think they have big data, but apparently the amount of data that NOAA processes is it's enormous.
Wow, I hadn't even considered that. That's super interesting then. Okay, well, number 3 and 4 kind of go together, so let's start with number 3. If you had to choose between spending your time with a book, a TV show, or a feature-length film, which one are you going to choose?
Probably the book.
Okay, and you can elaborate here in number 4. So number 4 is Now this time of year, tons of lists out there of this is the best of 2022. So best books of 2022. And so this question is, what was your best book of 2022?
Boy, that's a tough question because I'm not sure I did that much reading in 2022. I have a toddler, and so often I end up just going to bed straight away.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair. Or you go back a couple of years. Let's say just recent memory. What's one of the best books that you've read?
Let's see. There's a number of books I've been reading in the last couple of years that are just really remarkable. I mean, I think I might for this I might say I have to get the title right because it's long. A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers.
Okay.
It's not it's her first book, so it's not that new now. It's the first book of the Wayfarers series, which was a 4-book series. And she's now 2 books into her new Monk and Robot series. But The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, it surprised me and it was fun. And it was one of those books where I was like halfway through it and I was still kind of waiting for it to start. And sometimes that's really bad. Like I've had that vibe with Neil Stevenson before and I just end up hating the book. But with Becky Chambers, what I realized was like I was waiting for it to start, but I still couldn't put it down. Like I was so interested in what was happening. And it's just because the way she creates tension and handles drama and stuff is not typical. And so what it felt like setup, but it wasn't setup. It was the actual story, and it was wonderful.
So it didn't, and so you didn't feel like it actually ever really started. There wasn't a moment where it was like, oh yes, this is it. It just keeps going.
Yeah, and once I had the realization that wait, this is what's going on, and this is the drama, and this is the tension, and it was just so fun, and it's so much more relaxing than so many science fiction books. That
Interesting.
There's so much dystopian science fiction around now, and I don't think I can tolerate it anymore. And her books are a breath of fresh air.
Okay, I don't read much science fiction, so I feel like I'm going to check this out. I like the way that you described it.
Yeah. Well, if you want a fantasy novel that's also really quite good, it's very old, so maybe you've read it. Assassin's Apprentice would have been my second choice.
Okay.
For best books. It's old. Well, I mean, it's from I think the mid '90s.
Okay.
And it's yeah. I really love that book. I actually just sent it to a friend because I think they'll really like it too. But if you love fantasy, I highly recommend the Farseer trilogy.
I'm gonna check this out. I like adding to my list. So yes, this is great. This is great. Okay, number 5. I realize this might be an extension or the same answer as number 1, which is totally fine. But I was looking for the most valuable tool, or the tool that you find to be the most valuable in the process of building websites.
Ooh. The tool that's most valuable. Honestly, it's got to be, I mean, this feels like a little bit of a cop-out, but the web.
Fair.
Because
that's fair.
I wouldn't even be doing what I do. Yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't even be able to do what I do if there hadn't been so many resources like the Mozilla Developer Network, and now there's web.dev from Google, and even Stack Overflow if you're careful. I don't know. I mean, I have a CS degree, but they weren't teaching web development when I was in school. So I had to learn all of it on my own after I graduated and got saddled with a web dev job. And I don't know, just I know that people think that things are getting out of hand and they're too complicated and there's too much stuff now, but there's also just so many ways to learn it.
Yes, yeah. So not the existence of the web, but you're talking more of like the accessibility to information and resources.
Yeah, and there's so many people out there writing courses that are being given away for free, and So many reference material and like, I don't know, if you were trying to learn to program C++ in the 90s, you went and bought a book and possibly bought yourself a C++ compiler and sat down in your room alone, and that's how you learned. And now there are forums and there's discords and there's all of these resources that are available because of the web, and they're built on the web, and the people on them build the web, and it's like it's so easy to learn.
That's a yes. That's a great way to put that. I love that. Okay, number 6 is, where is the most interesting place you've traveled?
Most interesting was probably Nigeria.
Oh, okay.
I could spend a week there for work. We were doing a project with UNICEF on polio eradication, and spent a week with their polio eradication initiative in Nigeria. I missed the trip to Afghanistan, which doesn't sound like it was too much of a miss because they never left the compound, and I think there was a suicide bombing the day they left.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, not as good. What, in Nigeria, were you in Lagos, or were you all over the place, or?
We were in, let's see, we were not in, wait, no, we were not in Lagos. We were in the capital, and the name now escapes me. Parenthood. And then we spent a few days up north in a province called, I think, Sokoto.
Okay.
So yeah, we get to see a little bit of the capital, and then we went up north, which was a lot more rural, and spent some time in some of the villages there. They use a lot of locals to help manage the vaccination process, and so we were meeting with some of them to talk about like how they go around doing vaccinations and how they track data of who's vaccinated.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating trip.
Yeah, it was neat. It's an unusual experience for a white person to be the minority, and it's the kind of thing I think I wish more people could experience, or I wish that like it was less of a thing. But yeah, I was traveling with one guy who was 6 foot tall. We're both Irish heritage, so we're both pale as paper. And then we were also traveling with a Korean woman and a Chinese man, and so we were all curiosities to every single kid in all of these villages.
Yes. Okay.
And they were all just, I don't know how much of it was just because they wanted to get a look at the weird looking people, and how much of it was because they are just nice people, but everybody was super nice and wanted to take lots of pictures. And
that's fantastic. Oh yeah, that's great. Okay, I feel like I could keep going on there, but yeah, gotta keep going. Okay, so number 7 is, what's the best career advice that you've received?
I'm not an ambitious person, so I don't know that I've received that much career advice because I don't think I've sought it.
Okay.
Part of that is almost certainly a function of the privilege of being a white man in the software industry, and people just assume that you know what you're doing. But I think I can't remember if this is something I figured out on my own or if someone told me this, but the one thing I always keep in mind is try not to become good at something you hate doing.
It's funny, but that's great. It's really good advice.
I mean, it's a great way to just make you hate your job, because if it's something you hate doing and you're good at it, and especially if you're the only person who's good at it, you're going to get stuck doing it all the time. So you got to be careful about drawing boundaries with people if they're asking you to do stuff that you just really don't enjoy.
I love that. Yeah, that's unique, but that's so valuable.
Or use it to make more money if that's
right. Yes, you can be a mercenary. Yes. Number 8. Yes, this is, we were talking backstage about this before the show. You're going to participate in the Bring Back Blogging project this month, and for those of you out there who don't know what it is, Google it. It's very interesting. You can read about it. But Evan, I'm curious, what is the thing? What about it is gets you really excited?
Yeah. So if anyone wants to find it, the URL is just bringback.blog.
Oh, great.
Um,
Perfect.
and I mean, I'm excited about it just because I really I like the idea of blogs. I like the idea of um, longer form writing, even though I often don't quite have time to sit down and read quite so many long form posts. But um, I think it lets people be more thoughtful. And I think having a place where you can just, write your thoughts down, express yourself is a nice thing. And I think if the indie web is not exactly accessible, people being able to web mention each other and communicate through blog posts is not exactly going to ever be mainstream. But I like the idea that people could write essays and respond to each other the way that scientists and philosophers did a couple hundred years ago. Um, it's slower than social media, and I think that helps.
Yeah,
'Cause
more time you have to form a full thought and all of that. Yeah.
yeah, and you're not just like, if I want to write a response to something somebody else wrote, the affordances for doing that are not on that person's blog. I have to go back to my website and write the thing. And it just kind of,
Mhm.
I think that a little bit of friction can help make people a little more thoughtful. And I would love to see a place where people are talking more about the things that interest them and the things that uh, are important to them, and not so much of the like back and forth that you get in social media, where people are jumping on each other and stuff like that. Like, if you don't want to read someone's blog, just don't read it.
Yes,
If you
yes.
don't like it, you don't have to read it. And if you do like it, then you keep reading it, and that's great. And you don't have to correct someone just because you don't like the same movies or something.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, last one. Number 9. You can host a lunch with anyone, alive or not. One person. Who would that person be?
Hmm. Well, I mean, for me, it would be very personal. It would be my grandfather, my mom's dad, because he died when I was a teenager, and I don't think I was fully old enough to appreciate all of the stories he had to tell when he died.
Mm-hmm.
He had been uh, he'd been in World War II, but when he enlisted in the army, they put him in the Army Corps of Engineers. So he was digging trenches, and the thing about my grandfather was he spoke French like a Frenchman. Um,
Okay.
when he would be in France, people would think he was like Canadian or Swiss or something if they detected an accent at all. Um,
Mm.
and it wasn't until at some point his CO figured out that he could speak French, and he was like, "Wally, what are you doing here?" And they sent him off, and he ended up being a translator in World War II.
Oh, interesting.
But he had lots of stories like that, and I only got a few of them because I was 15 and I wasn't interested. So I feel like a lunch to get to catch up with him and find out a lot more about that. The time he spent teaching uh, at the military école in Paris for a year. I think my mom was like 10, maybe 5. She was little. Um, so it'd be great to catch up with him again.
Yeah, that would be an amazing conversation. All right. Well, thank you very much, Evan. This has been just a really great show. Really excited to have you on. Now, but before we officially sign off, feel free to plug anything else that you're working on, and tell folks how to get in touch with you if they have further questions.
Sure. So the easiest way to figure out how to get a hold of me, I guess, would be my website, which is just darthmaul.net. So that's mall like the shopping mall, not the actual Star Wars character. Um, and that should have links to things like my Mastodon account, and things like that. I don't really have anything I want to plug, I don't think.
Okay, not a problem. Yeah. Great. Well, just for the rest of you, quick reminder that these shows are now recorded live on the first and third Tuesdays of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern Time in the United States, which is 5 p.m. GMT. The live shows then get syndicated on CFE.dev and YouTube as videos, and also wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll be back on January 17 with Mark Noonan from Cypress. We're going to talk about practical testing approaches for modern websites. Until then, from all of us at CFE.dev, thank you for joining us for this show, and we'll see you next time.